As kids, you have dreams, but no ability to achieve them. As an adult, we have the ability, but no more dreams. And I say that because today we're doing the podcast in a special place, at least special for me, which happens to be in the hangar with the airplane behind. We were just doing a shoot where we had the Ferrari, the Rolls, the Bentley, and for a lot of people, they may look at it, they may be inspired. For some other people, it's going to be, hey, he's just trying to show off. And to honestly tell you the truth, I am trying to show off, meaning that I'm trying to live my childhood dreams as an adult, right? And on this particular podcast, the goal is truly to talk about living outside the box and hopefully being able to achieve your dreams. And it doesn't matter if it's world travel, if it's to serve people who are hungry, to go do community service, or to go buy toys, cars, airplanes, or whatever it is that you want to do. And I want to take you back into my life, and maybe somewhere through that story, both of us will be able to connect, because all of us have different dreams, different aspirations, different passions. If you have kids, I think one of the biggest dreams most parents have is for their kids to do much, much, much better than they did. So I want to take you back, and that is to India. So I remember being about 8 or 10 years old, and a group of us standing kind of in this little soccer field, and an airplane flying over. And I remember telling my friends, one day I'm going to buy an airplane like that, right? And can you imagine, like, at the time, this is in 80s in India, you telling your friends. And for the longest time, they thought I was the biggest BS, meaning bullshitter. And yet, for most people, as a child, right, what do you say? Oh, I want to be a firefighter. I want to be in the police. I want to be in a military. I want to be a doctor. I want to be all these things all in one day. Depends on what your mood strikes. Is that bullshit? I don't think so. I think that's the start of your dreams. Yet what happens is, a lot of times, that as a child, a lot of people around you are going to tell you, oh, yeah, son, when you grow up, right? That a lot of times, if your parents are here, all they can see is to the next level. So let me put it in terms of perspective. If you grew up in a family where the average person made, let's say, 50, 60,000 bucks, 100,000 bucks, and you said, oh my God, I'm going to make 200,000 when I grow up, right? They may say, well, maybe. But how about if you say, I'm going to make 10 million? Guess what's going to happen? They're going to chuckle, they're going to laugh, they're going to say, oh, only if you win the lottery. Or I'm going to make 100 million, right? Guess what? Somebody is making that. Somebody is achieving that particular income, that particular dream. For me, I always was fascinated as a boy with cars, airplanes. The attractive women hadn't come yet. That comes a little bit later in life, right? But I mean, this is just what a lot of boys are attracted towards. Women, maybe something else, right? And yet, a lot of times, especially in an Indian family, even though my parents were high achievers, meaning extremely, extremely, extremely hard working, highly educated professionals. So compared to most of the families that I grew around, right, most of them, probably my parents did very, very well in terms of income. Yet, we were never supposed to talk about money. If I asked them, hey, how much do you make? They're like, well, we work hard. I'm like, no, that's not the question I asked. How much do you make? Yet that was never discussed in our family, right? Why? Because that was considered showing off. So I'm like, well, let me ask you this. We had at the time 2 or 3 cars at a time when in the entire neighborhood we lived in, there were maybe 2 cars. So to have 2 or 3 cars and a couple of people to drive them, is that showing off, or is that bettering your quality of life? At the time, I didn't know that. Now, I was always the guy that in my school, we had a couple of kids that if we had 2 or 3 cars, I would go to their house. They had a much bigger house. And they had 6, 8, 10 cars. And I would come home and tell my mom, hey, mom, you guys are professionals. You guys work much harder than their parents. Their parents aren't even as sophisticated. How come we only have 2 or 3 cars? They have 7 or 8. And I still remember my mom being so traumatized. She's like, you're not grateful for what we have, blah, 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 blah. You need to study. You need to quit, paying attention to this kind of nonsense. God has really blessed us. I'm like, I know God has really blessed us, but I would like more blessings, right? And then, of course, I would get my butt, handed to me because that was disrespectful. And I was always the kid that I would always question the status quo, meaning the examples my parents would give me were of highly educated relatives. Oh my God, this person has a PhD. Another person has a double PhD. This person is XYZ professor. And I was like, well, yeah, they may be very highly educated people, but how come if they're so highly educated, how come if they have a PhD in economics, their home economics is not that good? Meaning their financial situation is not that good. And a lot of times I remember that used to cause a little bit of a rift because I would open my mouth. So I have this thing, it's called a disease, which is called a big mouth and a small brain. A lot of people have that, where you speak before you think, right? And a lot of kids, like if you've ever seen that thing, which is the kids will say the darndest things. I was one of those kids who would just blurt out whatever was on my mind. So I'd go to relatives' houses and I'm like, how come you're poor? Now, obviously, I realized that sometimes I was extremely cruel. I wasn't trying to be as a child, but yet, fortunately or unfortunately, that's how my brain worked. And I remember, I'll never forget this. I went to Hong Kong as a little child, and I remember this Peninsula Hotel. So for anybody who's been to Hong Kong, there's a famous, world famous hotel. It's called the Peninsula, and they have a fleet of these Rolls Royces. All of them are green, and I remember looking at a Rolls Royce. At the time, the only time I had ever looked at a car like that was in a movie, right? James Bond or one of those type of movies. That's it. And yet here in the front of this hotel, I saw this iconic car with a smart looking chauffeur. And I remember telling my dad, hey dad, when I grow up, I'm going to buy one of those. And like most parents would, like, oh yeah, son, you got to study, you got to get a good education, and then you can maybe one day buy it. You'll have to work really, really hard. I really thought, now I couldn't figure, at the time, I hadn't quite figured it out. Now, fast forward that to about 90, I'm going to say 97, 98. And I remember sitting in Pittsburgh in front of a Rolls Royce dealership at night. I would not even go there during the day because my self-esteem was so low that I would get out of my little beat up car and they would know that I could barely afford a tire on the Rolls Royce, forget about the car. And I used to sit out there and I used to try to calculate how somebody would afford, I don't know at the time what the Rolls Royce was, 280, 290. Today it's 400,000, right? So I have no idea what it was at the time, but I could not in my mind figure out how somebody could save enough money to buy a car that at the time was worth $250,000 or 400,000 today, right? And I say all of that to say this, is that just as somebody's goal may be, hey, I'm going to play varsity basketball, varsity football, then I'm going to go to college and basically play college ball. Then I want to graduate to playing pros. The statistical odds of that happening are a heck of a lot lower than the statistical odds of somebody becoming a multimillionaire. And I truly, truly feel this way, that for the longest time for me, I had a very, very low self-esteem, right? A very, very low. I was very insecure about myself. And yet, the way I have kind of maybe, I'm not going to say achieved a lot of the things, but I think I've done better than a good bunch of people, is by small steps. I've always had a long-term business plan. I've always believed you have to think through things in a step by step by step manner and take calculated risks, meaning not basically go for broke, but take calculated risks and think in long-term increments. I think Tony Robbins said it best, that most people underestimate what they can accomplish in 5 years, but they overestimate what they can accomplish in a week, a month, or a year. So don't be that person that underestimates what your abilities are. And I've always believed this, that I still remember I had bought a used car from my aunt, and I'll never forget this. It was a Mazda 626, right? And every day when I would drive home in this old car, I used to imagine that one day that particular symbol was going to turn into a Jaguar. At the time, I thought Jaguar was a nice, fancy car. And then I used to role play this in my head all the time. Then I used to think one day was going to be a Mercedes symbol. And then one day it was going to turn into a Rolls-Royce symbol. Now, some people will say it's kind of you speak that into reality. I truly believe that. Now, I'm not saying that you just put up pictures of airplanes or of whatever you want to achieve, and you're like, oh my God, one day I'm going to have it, one day I'm going to have it, and don't start working towards it. But I truly believe that, number one, God's been very kind to me in a lot of ways. You have to work hard. You have to have a business plan. You have to start working towards that. You have to sacrifice. But I truly believe you become what you think about all day long. There are people who are always like, well, I can't achieve something. I can't have it. I can't. And I'm not one of those people. What has always bothered me is, why not me? Meaning, like, we are in this hangar today, and the airplane right in front of me happens to be an airplane which probably 4.5, 5 million bucks, 6 million bucks, depending on what vintage you buy, meaning how old or new you buy. But a new one of those will probably go for about 15, 16 million. And it's the funniest thing, because when I didn't have an airplane, I thought, oh my God, I wanted a certain airplane. The day I got it, I wanted the next bigger one. The day I got the next bigger one, which is the one in the background, I now want the next bigger one. Now, this is an unending pursuit, mind you. And so I have to remind myself that, hey, I'm pretty blessed. So some people will say, well, is it contentment or is it complacency? I want to be content with what I have, but I don't want to be complacent, meaning I don't want to stay where I am, because if you're not growing, if you're not progressing, whether it's in terms of your family, whether it's in terms of your health, whether it's in terms of your finances, you're clearly going backwards, because there's no such thing as staying stagnant, right? So it's important to understand that. But for anybody that listens to this podcast, the one thing I will tell you, especially if you're lucky enough to live in America, the American dream, doesn't matter what your politics is, doesn't matter who you are, it's alive and kicking because of one reason. We, as Americans, meaning somebody who lives in America, we have an equal opportunity. I'm not saying we are equal, meaning we're not equal, because we're all born with different set of parents, with different set of circumstances. You may have a different set of skills, but our ability that we have to take that, and then we have to make the best of it. But the opportunity is equal. For you, for me, the question is, where do you think you are? And I'll end with this. So when I moved to Chicago, I used to work at a steakhouse. It was called Shula Steakhouse, and it was a hotel, which was a Wyndham Hotel. Today, it's called Westin. And I'll never forget this because I would work there, and it's a big hotel lobby, like any other hotel lobby, like big hotels. And in the middle of that, there was a bar. And so typically people would come, and I still remember there were 2 or 3 guys that were bartenders that used to work there. And we would all talk. And he's like, man, one day, I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to get into real estate, because I was in real estate during the day. I was trying to sell real estate. And in the afternoon, in the evening, I was working as a server so that I could be able to afford to pay my bills at the time. And I still remember they used to call me, and they used to laugh about it. They're like, oh yeah, Mr. Real Estate. And it's very funny. Now it's funny. At the time, it used to make me feel very poorly about myself, because I told them, hey man, in 90 days, I'm going to quit. Took me 120 days. But I still remember that the set of guys that used to work there, it's been since 2002. As we do this recording, it's 2025. Out of the 6 guys, men and women that used to work there, 5 of them are still there. The difference between them and me, the funny thing is this: every time I feel depressed, till this day, I go there and I have a prime rib sandwich, because the prime rib from day before from the steakhouse, they serve at that bar as a prime rib sandwich the next day. It's really good if you've never tried it. And the funny thing is that I'll go there, I'll always drive the Rolls because it makes me feel better about myself, and I'll park it right at the front of the hotel. And guess what? I'll leave it there because nobody will move that car. And yet I'll go inside, have a sandwich, and guess what they're talking about even today? Now, they don't recognize me, but yet guess what they're talking about? They're like, hey, what do you do? Like a bartender would ask, you just are chatting. I do real estate, blah, 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 blah. They're like, it's your Rolls Royce? I'm like, yeah. Like, yeah, man, I thought about getting into real estate. This is the exact thing they were talking about 22 years ago. And what changed? The only difference between them and me is not that I was any more intelligent. They saw themselves where they are today. I saw myself where I am today. That's the only difference between human beings. If somebody is 5 times more successful than I am, guess what? It's not because they're necessarily 5 times more intelligent. They see themselves where they are. So who you are today, and it doesn't have to be that you can't go forward, but you have to start thinking who you want to be and then start working in that direction. If you're just content with where you are, you're going to be like that bartender. Nothing wrong with it. If he's happy there, perfectly fine. But the more exposure you get, the more things that you see that other people have accomplished, the more you realize that, oh my God, if the other person can accomplish these things, so can I, and what is wrong with me? And I can't help but remember there's somebody in our real estate group called Mastery that we work with. And this lady, I think her name is Adriana, if I remember correctly, she happens to be 90 to 95% visually impaired, or blind, to put it mildly. The woman can't see. She just recently closed on her 15th rental property. And every time I see her, it's in a funny way, but I always kind of laugh about the situation, because I'm like, Miss Adriana, when you started losing your eyesight, and this is when she was in her 20s, did you ever feel depressed? She's like, and she'll laugh. I'm like, I'm asking you about you losing your damn eyesight, and you're laughing. She said, well, sometimes things happen. Ha, ha, ha. I'm like, it may be funny to you. It's not funny to me, right? I mean, think about that. Most of the times you would think people would feel depressed. Here's a woman every single day going out, looking at real estate, and the woman has no eyes. Like, how do you go look? She's like, oh, I got this agent. They just tell me what the property looks like. I just feel it. And then I imagine in my mind what it would be and what I can do with it. See, the difference between her is most of us have eyes and we cannot see. This woman is almost 95% visually impaired, yet the eyes are in her mind. The question is, what about you? Where do you go? This podcast wasn't not about real estate. For me, real estate was a medium to get from point A to point B. That's all it is. It's just a medium. Yet the question becomes is, what about you? What are you going to do with it? Are you going to wallow where you are? Or are you going to go to the next level? If you're not going to do it for you, if you have kids, do it for them. Because hopefully your kids will be 4, 5, 6 times more productive in a better situation, because today in America, it's still possible. This is Andrew Holmes with Cashflow for Life. Thank you and talk to you soon.